Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Archive and Center for American Music's new free monthly web series called Conversations with Our Curator. My name is Melissa Ziobro, and I am said curator. If you're not super familiar with the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music at Monmouth University in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey, we preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen and celebrate the history of American music and its diversity of artists and genres with our archival collection, programming, and exhibits. We are currently in the midst of planning for a brand new 30,000 square foot museum facility scheduled to open in the spring of 2026. You can see more about our work at springsteenarchives.org. But back to tonight's program. This free monthly web series will feature researchers and writers exploring new perspectives in American music history. After an initial conversation with me, audience Q&A will follow. That'll be really the fun part, right? I expect these will run roughly an hour or so. Tonight, for the first of these events, we are joined by David Hamilton Golland, Dean of the Wayne D. McMurray School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth. We'll be discussing his brand new book, Livin Just to Find Emotion, Journey and the Story of American Rock. So Dave, thanks again for joining us. You are such a good sport for going first before we have had the opportunity to build up any following. So I really, really appreciate that. Before
Well,
we
thank you,
dive,
Melissa.
yes, thank you. Before we dive into the new book, which I know everybody's dying to hear about, tell us a little bit about your background, though. How are you drawn into the historical field?
Oh, sure. Well, when I was growing up in New York City, um, my mom really was the one who was the most interested in history among the people in my family. And the books, I cannot remember a time in my life where I lived anywhere where it wasn't like every single wall was lined with bookcases, books upon books upon books, and almost all of it from on my mother's side was history. And I remember reading at a very young age. I forget the name of the historian, but I was very young, and I read the entire history of the Plantagenet dynasty, which were the folks that William the Conqueror he was sort of the first of these folks, and they kind of go all the way up through Richard the Third, and just sort of all the all the adventures that they had. And I remember particularly that historian kind of exploded a myth. And this was a historian from the 1950s, I'm sure. But the way he kind of described the myth, I think it was it was actually probably about Richard the Third, because I think Shakespeare had probably written the play that was the myth of it, right? And I just remember the way this particular historian used the sources to kind of uncover new information about history. And I thought, wow, history isn't just some static thing that is unchanging. I mean, that was kind of my earliest realization um, that history is the way we perceive the past, and that it's always changing. And so, if someone out there in the internet world wants to call me a revisionist historian in kind of a snide way, I go, well, thank you so much for the compliment, because I've been trying my whole life to be a revisionist historian, because it's all about the revisions, and if I can bust myths, that's wonderful. I didn't, though, want to be a historian for most of my youth. I wanted to be a rock star. So kind of writing this book kind of melds a couple of my passions together for the first time. And I went to Music and Art High School in New York, which was the setting for the movie Fame. Excuse me. And studied vocal music there, and music theory and performance and sight reading and all that. And then in my 20s found that was not going to happen. And when I finally went to college, at I guess the advanced age of 26 or 27, I decided to study what had been my favorite quote unquote academic subject back in high school, which was also the same subject, the only subject that I took an AP in. And that was social studies, in other words, history. So I majored in history. And at some point, a professor, Myrna Chase was the professor. She said to me, you know, Dave, you're getting pretty good at this. We should talk about your future. And then I was sort of shuttled into graduate school and haven't looked back.
I'm struck by so many things in your thoughtful answer there. The fact that we're always telling our students to be open to exploring the journey of their studies. They needn't come into college right at 18 with a clear awareness of what they're going to be because they don't even know what possibilities are available. And
Yeah.
the second thing I'm struck by is, listen, if the rock star thing doesn't work out, historian is the obvious, clear backup choice. I can think of nothing. It's a better backup choice, Dave. So your first two books are not about music history. Just tell us a bit about those, please.
No, they're not about music history, but they are connected, and I'm sure we'll get to that later on. My dissertation, well, really, I wanted to. My initial thought when I was an undergrad was maybe my senior thesis, maybe I should do something on Jewish history. And my advisors all told me, well, no, you're Jewish. You shouldn't do something that is too personal because it's difficult to approach objectivity. And so, but I still wanted to do something about sort of in the vein of, I guess our colleagues in world history call this subaltern history, right? The idea of a population within a larger population, a minority population, or at least a population that is treated as second class, right? And so I started finding myself as an undergrad moving into African American history, but I wanted to find kind of an interesting niche there. And ultimately, I settled on as an undergraduate, and then for my master's degree for those two theses, I did work in the 19th century. I was focused on how industrialization worked in the slave society of the American antebellum South. And I kind of looked at case studies, and my undergraduate degree was on Maryland. Ironically, here I am in Maryland again. I'm traveling, and I'm spending the night in Maryland. And then my master's degree, which I did at the University of Virginia, was on the same topic, but in Virginia, how slaves were employed in industry. And by the time I got to starting to work on my PhD dissertation, I really had enough with the 19th century. And so I kind of did a real switch there, and I moved into studying affirmative action. And I found that there was this little studied program called the Philadelphia Plan. What intrigued me about the Philadelphia Plan, which was the first major US federal affirmative action program, was that it was sort of pushed first by the Johnson administration and then by the Nixon administration. And I thought, well, that's interesting. These are two sort of seemingly completely different political worlds, and yet they're both pushing the same thing. What's the story behind that? And the more I looked into it, the more I wanted to do even more research on it. And it ultimately became the basis for my dissertation, which became my first book, Constructing Affirmative Action, The Struggle for Equal Employment Opportunity, which was published in 2011 by the University Press of Kentucky. Which has a deep civil rights series. And one of the larger than life individuals in that story was a man named Art Fletcher. Art Fletcher, who was an an assistant secretary of labor in the Nixon administration, who was a Black Republican, who had been a football star and was a World War II veteran and called himself the father of affirmative action. And then after leaving the Nixon administration, coined the phrase, or coined the final version of the phrase, "a mind is a terrible thing to waste," when he was the executive director of the United Negro College Fund. And the more I learned about him, the more fascinated by him I became. And even when I was still working on the dissertation, one of my readers, Joshua Freeman, at the CUNY Graduate Center said, well, David, why don't you just do a biography of Art Fletcher for your dissertation? And I kind of joked and I said, well, maybe that'll be my second book. And at that point, I didn't even know if I would be fortunate enough to have a tenure line position and then able to do a second book. But, you know, a few years later, I did. And so I decided that my second book would be that biography of Art Fletcher. And it's called A Terrible Thing to Waste, Arthur Fletcher and the Conundrum of the Black Republican. And that was published in 2019 by the University Press of Kansas, another academic press with a very strong civil rights series.
Okay, so that is fascinating in its own right and very much informs now our pivot. Let's move to the new book. How do you decide that you're going to take the leap and start work, really commit yourself to this passion project?
I mean, it takes a pandemic. You know, I mean, everything shut down, as we all recall, in March 2020. And yet life continued, but it continued in that very sort of weird way where we had to do everything. Where, see, what we're doing tonight, it's a privilege. You know, we've learned how to make Zoom a tool that's just one of the many in our toolbox, but we're not depending on it anymore the way we were that, especially that first year, really that first year and a half after March 2020. If it's your whole life, as we all remember, it's oppressive. It's very difficult to conduct meetings. If you're not trained on all the aspects of online teaching, it's very difficult to use it to teach. And yet we all had to do it. And it's exhausting, frankly. It's more tiring to use this medium for our daily work than it is to show up. And because I find actually going into the office, I find it energizing, you know, and that was the same when I was a full-time faculty member. Going in and teaching you know, I'm moving my body, I'm walking back and forth across the classroom, front, back, sides of the classroom without even realizing I'm doing it. I'm getting all my steps in, and it's just a much more healthy way to go. And at the end of the day, yeah, maybe my legs would be tired, but I would just feel great. And I really didn't have that feeling month after month after month of the pandemic going by and no end in sight. And it was December of 2020, and that second semester had ended of the pandemic world. And, you know, I was just sort of lying in bed, and I was reading a book about Journey from 2011 or 2012 by a British journalist named Neil Daniels, probably called Don't Stop Believin'. I think it was called Don't Stop Believin'. And I was glad to read it because I've actually been a Journey fan and a Steve Perry fan for over 40 years now, since I first heard Don't Stop Believin' in a jukebox, from a jukebox in the Borscht Belt of downstate New York, up in Orange County there one summer. And so I'm reading this book, not thinking anything, it's going to change my life or anything like that. And then, but every time he starts to talk about an interesting topic, I get excited and I turn the page, and then he drops it. And I sort of felt like there were so many missed opportunities to develop stories. And I should say also, I knew the basic story of the band already from being a sort of a diehard, dedicated Journey fan all those years. I just wanted so much more. And then my wife turned to me, Lana, and she said, well, why don't you write the book about Journey? And I just sort of scoffed, just like I did before when my graduate professor said, why don't you write a biography of Art Fletcher? Maybe I'll do it for the second book. Well, here I am, and I'm sort of scoffing again. I'm like, no, I'm a civil rights historian. I'm an African-American history historian. I do race. I don't do music, but I don't know. It was this strange moment in time when I thought, all right, well, if there's one project that I could probably mostly do online, it's this, because we now live in the era of newspapers.com, and I'll just design some really good search queries. I know the names of everyone who has ever been in the band. I know the names of all the albums, and I'm sure I could come up with a few thousand sources. And in fact, I did. And you know, it took me a couple of weeks of thinking about it. The other thing is, would I get a book contract? Is it an academic book? Is it really research, or is it just a fun project? Who's going to publish me? And ultimately, I decided that what I wanted to do was lend my scholarly expertise to something that I thought would be really fun. And and as the pandemic's rules started to lift, as I got a couple of jabs in my arm, I started to find ways to get out, and went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame archives, for instance, and started building a community of folks who were helping me out, sending me, for instance, legal documents from the various lawsuits that members of Journey have gotten into over the years. And and so that was kind of the pivot. I forget, is one of your questions going to be about, did it end up becoming more about race? And because it certainly did, but I don't want to step on a future question.
No, keep going. Don't
Just keep going. Yeah. So I didn't really have a thesis other than this is a famous rock band that, you know, lots of people like. And so buy the book, you know, that was kind of my thesis initially, which isn't, you know, it's sort of like not a thesis, at least not from a scholarly perspective. But the more I dug into it, the more I realized that there was a thesis, because, you know, as we all know, you don't just look at primary sources. It's a new topic for me, so I amassed a library of secondary sources. I created a whole new shelf of books. At that point in my house, now you can see it in my office. It's a separate shelf. If any of you come to visit, just ask me, I'll point it out to you. It's the Journey shelf, or the music shelf, really. Only 4 or 5 of them have anything to do with Journey, but and Ken, Ken Campbell, your book is up there, the one about the Beatles in the 1960s, and I just started reading, and then I read a book by Jack Hamilton, which talked about race and rock and roll, and I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder how Journey fits into that, and ultimately, I borrowed some of his thesis to develop my own thesis, which is that rock and roll integrated racially popular music, really for the first time in American history. Because even if you go back to jazz, it's not integrated. It's white people listen to Paul Whiteman and Al Jolson, but the real jazz, you know, is still African American. It's still quote unquote race music. With rock and roll, you have a real integration of popular music, and it kind of lasts until about Woodstock, and then it starts to resegregate again, popular music, that is. And rock and roll segregates into rock, which is coded for white listeners and performed by and large by white musicians, and soul, which is coded for African American listeners and is performed by and large by African American musicians, notwithstanding all of the exceptions to the rule, like Prince. And Jimi Hendrix actually is the exception that proves the rule, because of the way he was treated in the years of his career. And I actually, at some point, I think I call him the sacrificial lamb of integrated popular music. But where does Journey fit in? So Journey is actually founded in '73, which is one of the pivotal moments of the resegregation. From that point on, basically, there are Black radio stations and white radio stations in this country, and you can no longer hear Marvin Gaye and the Allman Brothers on the same station. And Journey's development from 1973 onward tracks some of the major developments in what I call the resegregation of popular music. And so what I say to people who are buying the book, who aren't necessarily scholars or who are really just Journey fans, what I say to them is there's a scholarly thesis there. It's like a thread that pulls you through the book, but you can actually ignore it and just enjoy a good book about Journey. But when I'm talking about the scholarship, I'm definitely talking about that thesis and how it works, and how Journey really epitomizes what I'm trying to say here.
Dave, How cognizant, if at all, do you think Journey was of this?
They're not cognizant necessarily of, well, it depends when, that's the thing we do as historians. We have to put ourselves in a particular time and things change over time. And so they're not really cognizant of it in the 1970s. They're growing, they're growing in, at least some of them, especially Steve Perry, are gaining knowledge of it in the 1980s. And I should also stress, for the most part, musicians really didn't necessarily want music to resegregate. Well, first of all, it cuts down on your audience, and that cuts down on your money, right? And they're putting out albums and they're going on tour, and they want everyone to show up at the concert, right? And in fact, when in the early 70s, Bill Graham was promoting Journey and he paired them with Ike and Tina Turner, it was a total disaster. And so the people who were fighting against this resegregation were failing, but they were trying to keep blending these. But yeah, it always depends on what time we're looking at. Mostly, however, musicians are not scholars, so they're not really thinking of things in this way. Just like the vast majority of people aren't necessarily thinking about race in a scholarly way. They don't, and very few people who haven't gone to grad school can deconstruct popular culture the way scholars do. So they're not kind of deconstructing on the fly. It's unfortunate now for so many of us with this, with our PhDs, we turn on the TV and it's not, a lot of it isn't pleasant anymore to watch TV because we find ourselves deconstructing in front of our families. Like, can you believe that the director did it that way? And have you thought about what's going on behind the scenes? And I just read an article about Django Unchained, which just completely, from in a academic journal, it was just completely exploded all sorts of myths about that movie. It takes a lot of the fun out of it. So yeah, I mean, they're not only are they mostly not cognizant of it, they also wouldn't approve of it. Not that they wouldn't disagree, but they wouldn't approve of it because musicians tend to be, if you can play music, they want to play with you, and it can be a great equalizer playing music. I mean, it's one of the great things about Santana, which is a precursor to Journey. Three people from Santana end up in the founding group of Journey, is that it is truly interracial and it's all about what they all think is good music. And it has nothing to do with where Michael Carabello came from and where Greg Raleigh came from and where Carlos Santana came from, which are three completely different places racially. So yeah, not so much.
I'd like to dig a little deeper into your source material. You mentioned, of course, newspapers.com, and the
Mhm.
digitization of newspapers and other archival sources is, of course, a huge boon for historians. You mentioned going to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Talk to us a little bit more about your source material and perhaps if there was a holy grail of artifacts that you were looking for and never found.
Oh, yeah. I don't know that these artifacts actually exist. I think for me, the Holy Grail would be if Steve Perry actually, if I could have interviewed him, but he doesn't do interviews with scholars. He'll do an interview with Tom Brokaw. I've deconstructed, oh, not Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, sorry. I've deconstructed his interviews in ways that I'm sure he would not appreciate. Uh, but yeah, the Holy Grail for me would be to actually have him talk to me and answer questions that I would ask that have to do with the thesis and really get behind, get deeper than the interviews he's done with journalists. The Not so much a Holy Grail, but the motherload of sources, lawsuit, legal filings. I mean, when they in 2020 they two members of Journey ganged up on two other members of Journey and fired them. I'd like to say illegally, but that implies criminality, and it's not really a criminal matter. So let's just say counter contractually. They violated their own contract, and they weren't legally allowed to fire these two, but they got away with it. And then there was a settlement, and I'm sure lots of, millions of dollars changed hands to make everybody satisfied. But what happened was the bass player who was fired, who had been one of the founders of the band, sued. He said, "You can't fire me. Not only am I a founder, but I own, I own equal shares in the company to what you own. So that's why you can't fire me." And then the lead guitarist who did the firing, I guess, countersued. And the thing about lawsuits, about legal filings, is they're going to say as much as they possibly can without perjuring themselves to try to win their case. And that means they're going to supply a lot of documents that previously are not or otherwise wouldn't be available to the public. And so analyzing these with a critical eye, well, these just opened everything up, because when ultimately I learned that the band is controlled by a corporate entity, I learned through these documents that were part of the legal filing. I learned who controlled the corporate entity, how that changed over the years, it came down to some specific language that went back to the 1980s, but that really helped me understand a lot more of the truth of what had happened with this band than I otherwise would have gotten. Because when celebrities do interviews, they bend the truth, and it's one of the things we all do as historians. Is we try to I often use the legal metaphor when I try to explain to students what we mean as historians by interrogate your sources. I say, imagine your source is an opposition witness on the stand, and you're the legal counsel trying to prove that they're lying, right? But you won't be able to prove that they're lying, but you can at least try to figure out what their motivations are for saying what they're saying. And when they're giving interviews to the press, there's a lot that they leave out. But when they're filing a legal document, they're going to put everything they can possibly put in to win that case. And it was just great. I feel bad for them that they had to go through all of that. And they've been suing each other since 1980, really, off and on over the years. But it just provided a huge, what I call the mother lode of sources.
So having done this very deep dive into the band, which, you admit had been a part of your life since you're a teen, do you still consider yourself a fan at this point? Or do you just get
Yeah.
sick of them? Can you still just listen to the music, Dave, and enjoy? Or do you need to kind of step away now? You also run this wonderful website, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't do a lot of work on the website anymore. I kind of give it an update every couple of months, a minor thing, really, just to keep it looking sort of fresh. But the heyday of the website was over 20 years ago. But yeah, am I still a fan? That's a good question. I don't know that I was, as an adult, I don't think I've ever truly been a fan of the people, the musicians themselves. Which is why I'm glad you're asking about the music, because I am still a fan of the music. Absolutely. And if anything, more so, because because of the deep dive, I heard so much more of their music that had never been released on albums. And my favorite, it's not my favorite Journey song, but which is always still is a deep cut, called "Winds of March" by Infinity. From Infinity, if anyone's interested, the 1978 album, the first one they did with Steve Perry. The song is called "Winds of March." Give it a listen. But I have kind of a real go-to now that is not available on any album, which is they're singing with two African American female singers from the band Stoneground and with the Tower of Power horn section and all of Journey. In I think that was also late 1978, and they're doing Motown and soul classics. And my favorite one to listen from that set is when they do Sam and Dave's Hold On, I'm Coming. And I can't watch that without moving. I still can. The moment I turn on that music, my shoulders just start moving and my neck starts moving and I just get into the groove. So yeah, I still love the music. I I I don't know actually if I'm still I don't think I'm deconstructing the music out of habit anymore. I definitely did a lot of deconstruction of the songs when I was writing the book, but I think I have been able to find a place where I'm not deconstructing it quite so much when the songs come on.
Yeah, did I understand correctly? Winds of March is performed by an integrated group
No,
in the
sorry.
Motown style?
I mixed that up. Sorry. Winds of March is a classic Journey song from their 1978 album Infinity, which is still my favorite song by Journey, and it is just Journey.
Gotcha.
Um, when they perform Sam and Dave's Hold On, I'm Coming, they do that with the integrated Tower of Power horn section and with I'm blocking on their names, but the two singers from Stoneground who are African American women. And that was for the King Biscuit Flower Hour episode that they recorded and never released. I mean, it
Mm.
was never put on the air.
And why was that? Do you know?
I do not know for sure. As I say in the book, I think it was probably the Journey manager did not allow it because at that time, he thought that the band would be most successful, I think, um, not pushing interracial music on their white audience.
Okay.
And the evidence I have for that is that they just the previous, in fact, earlier in 78 and also in 77, when they toured with Lynyrd Skynyrd, they got bigger crowds who were there for them. They were the opening act. Never had before or afterwards until Steve Perry joined the band. And so they kind of started to see a move towards country rock as being the most lucrative direction for them, which I know it sounds weird when it comes to Journey, but because Journey is not country rock. But remember the dynamic of 77, 78 is aside from disco, um, the number one album at that time is Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, which is a British blues band that becomes country rock inflected by the late 70s. I mean, just listen to Gold Dust Woman, for instance, from that album, right? And of course, the rise of Skynyrd until the plane crash, right? And Allman Brothers, and just the list goes on. And so the manager of Journey, Herbie Herbert, he's kind of trying to be in tune with what's going on in rock at the time and what he thinks is going to be what what is going to be successful for the band is this sort of country rock flavor, and they don't ever end up becoming country rock, and then Steve Perry joins and things move in a somewhat different direction, but the audience, if anything, became more white over time, and he probably felt that it was just a little too risque, a little too dangerous to have that out there. But you can see it on YouTube now.
Everyone's going to
Yeah,
have to
it's
go
good.
look that up when we get off
Yeah.
here. So is that example we're talking about kind of a perfect case study in this resegregation of the music that is central to your thesis?
Yes, absolutely. That and when they did a show for PBS, WTTW, the PBS station in Chicago, right after they opened for the Rolling Stones at Soldier Field, also in 1978. And because it was Chicago, they invited some local blues legends onto the stage with them, and they had a great jam. that lasted for like 20 minutes. And one of them, the name that pops into my head is Albert King. Albert King was playing on a Journey stage, right? And everybody was just in awe of these performers who were like legit blues players who had actually been part of the Great Migration and had learned the blues in the juke joints near cotton fields down on in Mississippi and Arkansas. And but the audience is completely white. They're all teenagers, and they don't quite get it. I'm looking at the footage, and I see the members of the audience looking at this very respectful, like, oh, and they're all from Chicago, so it's not like any of this was completely novel to the members of the audience. But they came to hear Journey, and now they're hearing Albert King, and so they're just sort of like looking at it very respectfully. But for them, it's clear that guitarist Neil Schon of Journey, vocalist Steve Perry of Journey, bass player Ross Valerie of Journey, organist Greg Raleigh of Journey, that it's all about watching them play with these blues players for the moment. But then the blues players leave the stage and it goes back to being Journey. And it's almost like there's a sigh of relief in the audience, which is really kind of sad, actually, because when you look at it, what's going to happen to Journey in the next 4 or 5 years is that they're going to start making tens of millions of dollars with their album sales and their later on the concert sales. Concerts didn't actually make money back then, but the album sales did. And all those artists like Albert King, they're not making the riches because they are pushed into the African American market by and large. And one of the books I read was by the white Jewish owner of a blues record label called Alligator Records, Chicago based. And I actually met him, and so I got him to sign the book. And he had been running this record label from the mid 1960s to about the mid 1990s, and some great Chicago blues artists were on there, but the margin of profit was minimal. I mean, he could barely keep himself going year after year after year, despite the fact that this is incredibly, incredibly complex and frankly beautiful music that the blues actually has allowed rock to become this, I don't know, billion-dollar industry. Is that what rock became by the 1980s? I don't know what the numbers are because I haven't studied the entire industry, but certainly for Journey, I mean, even now the company is making $30 million a year just from basically touring without even Steve Perry. So it's a lot of money that has come from a white musical inheritance of Black musical style, and almost none of that money is making it back to those, or has historically made it back to those African American artists.
Well, I had better stop asking questions because we promised that the audience would get to ask some. So let's pause there. Thank you so much, Dave, for your remarks thus far. And let's open it up to the audience. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question, or if you would like, type it in the chat and I'd be happy to read it for you. Ken Campbell, I see that you put your camera on, so I think you want to ask a question.
Hi, Ken.
Well, hey, Dave. Yeah, no, that's great. Congratulations, again.
Thank you.
You deserve all the accolades you're getting for the book. And I just thought maybe I'd take this opportunity to share with you and get your comments on the one time that I saw Journey in concert. So this isn't really like a serious academic question or anything. Maybe I'll think of one, but I probably in the 90s, and I saw them at what was then the PNC Arts Center. I'm not sure if it's still called that or whatever. And it was Foreigner and Journey, and Foreigner was opening for Journey, and I was familiar with the bands that I'm a bit older, but I mean I listened to them through the late 70s and 80s. wasn't a huge fan, but I liked them well enough. The thing that struck me, and I will never forget it, is that Foreigner came out. The sound quality was so poor. The performance was so lackluster. I felt like I was watching like some high school garage band. Sorry about that. It muted automatically. I felt with Foreigner, the sound quality was so bad, the performance was so lackluster. Um, I felt like I was watching like a high school garage band, rock band. And then Journey came out, and unbelievable. I mean, the quality, the sound, the showmanship. I mean, it was special. It was unbelievable. It was one of I mean, they're not my favorite group, so I wouldn't say it's like my favorite concert, but it was one of the best concert
Yeah.
performances that I ever saw. So I wondered if like was that like an abnormal experience that I had, or if you could talk about like the contrast between Journey and their contemporary groups in terms of their performance style and skill.
So thank you. First off, you saw the Vacations Over tour in 1998, and it was the first tour that they did after Steve Perry left the band. I hate to be such an encyclopedia. I saw them at PNC about 2 years later, and who opened for them? John Waite opened for them, and I think someone else, maybe Peter Frampton. Um, Here's why. And I don't want to speak ill of Foreigner itself. I would speak ill of their management. And maybe it's actually, I think the critics would actually say that Foreigner is more pure in this way. But the reason I think why that happened is that Journey had management, and it was a different management company by 98. They had Irving Azoff management, which was he's most famous for being the manager of Eagles, and he engineered the Hell Freezes Over tour for Eagles. I think he still is managing the Eagles, but now he's got like a stable, and he's a big corporate mega whatever. But from the beginning, Journey's corporation, which they all co-owned with their manager, Herbie Herbert, um, they had they took every little thing very, very seriously. So whereas Foreigner made great music, in my opinion, I mean, like I love Jukebox Hero. Everything on everything on Foreigner 4, for instance, was one of my favorite albums growing up. But they didn't have what Journey had in terms of the management. So one of the things that Journey pioneered was the big screen. So Journey in 1982 put these giant screens next to the stage. So suddenly, way up in the nosebleeds, you could see the drummer's nose start to bleed. I mean, they just had multiple cameramen went running around getting all these shots and putting them up on these big screens, and that's just sort of one example. There's so many others, but they took the business side of it so seriously, and I think that's what you saw. They were not going to miss a beat. They were also that particular tour, because it was the first tour since Steve Perry left. I mean, they really didn't make any money themselves on that tour. That was what they called the break-even tour, because they were reintroducing themselves to the fans, and a lot of fans walked out when they found out that Steve Perry was not going to be there. It's like, we're not getting our money's worth if it's not Steve Perry. I thought the new guy at that time, Steve Augeri, is his name. He was from Brooklyn. I thought he was great, actually. So those were kind of some of the dynamics, I think, that were at play. When I saw them a couple of years later with John Waite and Peter Frampton, I don't think the difference was quite so stark, but there was a lack of security during the Frampton part, and people just crushed forward to the stage. Someone jumped up on the stage like a fan, jumped up on the stage, put two fists in the air and, big grin on his face, and then was sort of hustled off by the staff. You don't see that at the Journey shows. It's just so utterly professionally cared for. Every little thing, every little bit counts as far as their management team is concerned.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I don't want to monopolize, but if I could just ask a quick follow-up question. I did on a little bit more maybe of an academic, but it's also related to my experience, is
Sure.
your focus is on race, but what about gender? Like another thing that really struck me about that concert was that there were a lot of young girls there, teenage girls there, who, I mean, I felt like it was in the middle of Beatlemania. I mean, they were really, I mean, unlike most rock concerts I've been to, they were crazy for Journey. And I don't know if that's been your experience, but if you wanted to comment on like, the gender aspect of their, fandom and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I returned to that theme a few times in the book. And I also talk about sexuality. For instance, Steve Perry, when he first joined the band in 1977, 78, he was so skinny, he bordered on emaciation, and he had this long, perfectly conditioned black hair that would cover his sideburns. His chest was almost hairless, and he would wear these button-down shirts where all the buttons would be unbuttoned, and then he would tie it at the bottom, which kind of created a plunging neckline evening gown kind of look. He looked incredibly feminine on the stage. And so there's a whole lot that I unpack there. But as for the fans, yeah, I mean, when Herbie Herbert, the manager, decided that they weren't going to air the King Biscuit Flower Hour episode, that was when all their fans were teenage boys for the most part, who were listening to progressive rock when Journey was progressive rock. And that's all about album-oriented rock, listening to the FM radio in your bedroom, like Pink Floyd The Wall, like the idea of the full album, But when Steve Perry comes in, it starts to shift. And after the Escape album comes out in 1981, suddenly the audience seems like it's completely changed to teenage girls, 13, 14, 15-year-old teenage girls. And it's a very different audience. They are basically my audience now. When my publisher and my publicist ask me, who are we marketing this to? I say, you're marketing this to a woman in her 60s, a white woman, most likely in her 60s, because that's who they've become now, right? The teenagers of the early 1980s. That's actually the first I've heard that you saw teenage girls in the late 1990s. That's new to me. My experience in that era was that it was mostly middle-aged people my age and older. But
And they knew every word to every song. It
are
was
you sure you
it
saw
was
them in you sure you
Maybe
saw them
their
in 98?
parents,
yeah,
if
no,
they're
I'm
listening to their
yeah,
mom's
yeah, I
music.
don't know. Yeah, I
There's
yeah, I
that, but the
yeah,
thing is, when
I am
Journey
sure it was the
resurges,
90s.
you're sure
I
it
am
was the
I no, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
because their resurgence really is led by the song Don't Stop Believin', and 98, 99 is kind of a low point for the song. Adam Sandler makes fun of it in The Wedding Singer, does a violin version in the first wedding, the one where he's jilted at the altar. And that ramps up through the TV show, the movie Monster, the TV show Glee, Underdog Sports Anthem, up to the Sopranos final episode in 2007, when suddenly everybody knows. That was my experience of it, and that was my experience of the scholarship of it. Not doubting you, just saying that wasn't what I observed. But I think Melissa's probably right. It's like it's their kids who showed up.
Could be, yeah, could be. Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Good thing.
Thanks, Ken, for your questions. Another question from the audience. You can unmute yourself and ask, or type it in the chat, and I'd be happy to read it for you.
Oh, I can talk. That's easy enough.
Hi, David.
How you doing? I mean, I'm listening to all this about race, and I can't help but be reminded, that the guy they got to replace Steve Perry, who they found on YouTube, is Filipino, Arnel
Yes,
Pineda. How does that
yes.
play into the whole sort of issue with race when it comes to the band specifically?
Yeah, in a couple of ways. Thank you for that question. He's actually the third replacement. The first two came from Brooklyn. The third comes from the Philippines, and he's still there. It really plays out in two different ways. In the first, he faced so much racism when he took that gig. I have footage that was from one of my sources of people in a parking lot tailgating before a show, where the young white woman, she finds out who he is, and she says, "Well, he really ought to be from here." And someone, the interviewer says, "Well, don't you think that's racist?" And she says, "No, no, I'm not a racist, but he really should be from here." He got death threats. His wife told him to wear a bulletproof vest on stage. He did not. And so that's one way that it plays out. But another way that it plays out is that, in a sense, he allows the listener to reinterpret "Don't Stop Believin" and all of the other songs. And he expands the Journey fan base. Really, in the 2000s, before he was hired, Journey had kind of descended into there were some rough years around 2004, 2005, 2006, where they're playing like state fairs, and they're mostly playing in red state fairs. And he allows them to expand the fan base to the immigrant community, and back around the Pacific Rim. I mean, they had never played the Philippines, but I think they had also never played Chile before he came into the band. And they went back to Europe. In fact, they're going back to Europe again. They just announced they're going back to Europe again this fall. But he really kind of allowed them to retake superstardom. And I think it's because he's opened up additional really racial markets to them that kind of he gives people permission, a wide swath of people permission to be Journey fans around the world. With that said, of course, there is one place outside of the United States that never stopped believing, you might say, and that's Japan. From the first time they set foot in Japan, which I think was probably 1980, when they were recording their live album, right up till today, the Japanese fans have not stopped believing in this band.
Yeah, put them right up there with Cheap Trick, right?
Thanks for your question, David. Okay, other questions from the audience? So, Dave, I'm curious, are there more music history books in your future?
I don't know. The Holy Grail, in theory, could be that Steve Perry reads the book and goes, "Okay, I disagree with some of the things he said about me, but he clearly is doing his best to be objective. I'd like him to do my biography." All right, maybe I would do that. But that's the nature of the Holy Grail, right? It's a chalice that you never actually get to drink from. So no, I don't. And that's the other thing is like, with the exception of the second book, where it kind of was almost predetermined from before I had even finished my dissertation. Since then, I mean, certainly this third book, it just sort of fell into place, like my decision to do it. So I can't really predict what I'm going to do next. I mean, though, being at Monmouth University, there's two Kens who do the Beatles. So maybe the pressure will be on that I have to find something interesting to say about the Beatles just to join Ken Campbell and Ken Womack in that wonderful world. But the other thing about being at Monmouth is that we have the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music, and Bob Santelli has a long and storied career behind him writing in this era. I have his Woody Guthrie book actually in my office on display. So there's so many other options. I suppose Bruce himself, writing about something that has to do with Bruce Springsteen's career, maybe I might go in that direction, but really I can't predict at this stage.
All right. Well, in the meantime, we want everybody to go out and get a copy of Livin Just to Find Emotion, Journey and the Story of American Rock. Thank you so much, David. Thanks everybody for joining us for our first go round here with conversations with our curator. Next month for Women's History Month, we'll have the authors of Mary Climbs In, The Journeys of Bruce Springsteen's Women Fans by Laureen Mangione and Donna Luff. So keep an eye on springsteenarchives.org and our social media for more info about that. We are ending perfectly in an hour. I love a well-timed event. Thanks again, Dave. Any closing words from you?
Just thank you once again, Melissa, for organizing this. This was a lot of fun. And I will also say, anyone on this call can come on by my office and I'll sign your copy. I'm also doing a book launch event in New York City that will be on March 27th on the Upper East Side. More information, journeyhistorybook.com. That's journeyhistorybook.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave, and all. Have a great night.
Night,
Thank
everybody.
you.